Okay, chapter 9 is going to focus on special challenges, and I wish I could rename your chapter. So it's not necessarily special challenges. What we're going to talk about is different kinds of disabilities and ways to adjust your health education practices to be inclusive of everyone. So while their challenges is no different than chapter 8 when we talked about wanting to make sure that we're culturally competent. We also want to be competent in our methods of communication for people who might be hearing impaired or people who are visually impaired. So really, I think this particular chapter just dovetails nicely at the end of chapter 8 because these things go together, and it's really just about being person-centered with your audience. So objectives are to list some populations that might require the health educator to prepare things differently. So if you have somebody in your class who is deaf, then you're going to need somebody who is fluent in American Sign Language if that's what the person needs. But don't assume that just because a person's deaf that they're going to be fluent in American Sign Language. You also want to think about health concerns that might be unique to certain populations. So there's all kinds of different issues that we could be getting into here. We're not going to get into all of those, but some people who have certain disabilities are also more vulnerable to certain diseases. For example, folks who have physical limitations sometimes might be at more risk for obesity because they might have fewer physical activity opportunities. So we want to define some terms, list some common mistakes in working with special populations, and really focus primarily on strategies. So your chapter goes into a lot of depth of different considerations, but I just really want to focus today with you on the strategies to help you to be effective in your health education delivery for folks who might need some accommodations when you go out to do your presentations. So the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization defines three clarifications of often used labels. So we're going to clarify impairment, disability, and handicap. So impairment, according to them, refers to an abnormality in the function or of organs or systems. Impairments are typically associated with a medical or organic condition, such as being nearsighted, having heart conditions, cerebral palsy, or hearing disorders. A disability refers to the impact of impairment on a functional ability. So it can include a total or partial behavioral, mental, physical, or a sensory loss of functioning. So they say that all disabled people are exceptional, but the reverse is not necessarily true. And it's possible for a person to have a disability that doesn't result in any kind of deviation from the expected performance level. Please keep that in mind. So just because a person has a disability doesn't mean that they necessarily even need an accommodation or see themselves differently. I mean, I think it's kind of superficial to assume that just because somebody has a disability that they would automatically need some sort of accommodation of some kind, because we have all kinds of exceptions to that in our society that we see daily. A handicap refers to the social and environmental restrictions placed on a person's life as a result of a disability. So the person isn't handicapped, it's a restriction, and not all disabled people are handicapped. So the consequences of labeling are many. So the labels can sometimes emphasize the negative instead of stressing the positive. See, this is where I'm hesitating with you guys too, because the accuracy of the label could be really questionable, and labeling doesn't accurately account for differences between individuals. And then remember that conditions rarely stay static. So you know, what might be challenging today. You know, a condition can get better, a condition can get worse. So this is just a point in time, and we need to always be mindful of that. So Public Law 94.-142 in 1975 coded the rights of all exceptional children and youth to a free and appropriate education. And then the guidelines were later updated in 2004. So these are the different categories of exceptional children. So autism, deafness, deafblindness, developmental delay, emotionally disabled, hearing impairment, mental retardation, visual impairment, including blindness, orthopedic impairment, multiple disabilities, other health impairment, specific learning disabilities, speech and language impairment, and traumatic brain injury. Your text goes into detail on each of these. So I would say it's really important to understand all those details, particularly if you're going to be teaching in those kinds of settings, or if you're, if you're a classroom teacher, that's going to matter as well. For most of you as health educators, these are not things that would necessarily be affecting you. So now I have to say, like for myself, for example, I came and did a presentation, actually a series of presentations at one point, at a center for people who had traumatic brain injury. So before going in there, I talked with the program coordinator to understand better like how I should adjust my presentation, what kinds of things I should expect. And also I asked the program coordinator to stay there with me for the first time so that way she could give me signals if I was doing anything that was not helpful or that was inappropriate. I also, in terms of developmental delays or other kinds of mental retardation. So I taught for a long time a series at the Developmental Disability Center in Orange, and it was sexuality education, and that was a very different teaching experience. It had to be, I had to make sure that I was being very precise in what I was saying. I think you may have heard by now, like I use a lot of metaphors, I use a lot of examples. When I was working over at the Developmental Disability Center, it was very important to be very literal with folks. There were examples of health educators who would come in and do presentations where they put condoms on bananas as the penis model, and then the clients later on would put condoms on bananas and not understand why they were pregnant. Kind of going back to chapter 8 too, there's also been great injustices that have been done where people with developmental disabilities have been automatically sterilized without their permission sometimes, because some people have felt like it's been inappropriate for them to have kids. There's a lot to all of these different things, and so you can definitely read up on that more in the chapter, and what I want to focus on for the video is how to adjust your health education materials and your style so you can meet people's needs. So the clients that you're perhaps going to meet, folks who have visual impairments, folks who might have learning disabilities, ADD or ADHD, and also how to work with people who might be deaf or hard of hearing. So the effects of health education for visually impaired people really depends on the level of visual impairment that they might have. There's so many, there's equipment and different kinds of ways of adjusting that can really help people. So people who are blind may be really limited sometimes in their social and environmental experiences depending on their level of comfort, their care situation, but folks are not all the same, and so we've got to make sure that we're customizing as much as we can. So there's some aids for the material for folks who are visually impaired. One thing that you want to do is just limit the relationships between things in the environment that are not discernible to for folks who are blind. So again, like I use a lot of metaphors kind of when I speak, and so if somebody's never seen something before, some of those metaphors may be pretty useless. use concrete examples and avoid kind of more abstract concepts. Also, if you're providing a health education intervention for someone who's visually impaired, really avoid kind of some of the other sources of stimulation. So, like, I wouldn't be playing music in the background or something like that, because you want folks to really be able to focus and to concentrate. Sometimes children who haven't had children who were born unable to see might be passive, and they might need to be taught how to get more involved. And you might need to use other kinds of methods like tactile learning or things like that. So please explain how individuals can explore their physical environment. For people who have some level of vision, make sure that you're maximizing that. If you're in a mixed audience with folks who are not visually impaired, give them a chance sometimes to talk openly about it, if that's appropriate. And make sure that, again, you're engaging in active, maybe tactile learning opportunities, so that way everybody can be included. And honestly, if you don't know what you should be doing, ask them for advice, or ask the classroom coordinator or the site coordinator. Ask others for help and advice, because again, even if you've worked with folks who are visually impaired in the past, you didn't work with that particular person, so they might have unique needs that you're not familiar with. Make sure that you repeat anything that's written on the board, and clarify like charts or graphics or anything that's mostly visual. Definitely be very descriptive as you're talking about topics, so that way you're providing as much adjectives, as much depth as possible. If the person is using Braille, allow that person to have extra time, and really encourage your learners to use any technology or any other techniques that might help to facilitate their learning. Learning aids can be divided into two categories. There can be optical aids, which are glasses and magnifiers, and non-optical aids, such as Braille. And so in your book, you may want to check out figure 9.2 for ways of adapting to larger print. Also, if people have visual impairments, you want to have them in the front of the class where they can see a little bit better. And make sure that the graphics are clearly defined against the background. So don't use like really busy backgrounds for your slides, and make sure that you have very clear contrast between the print and the background. Make sure that you use black print on a white background, because that's going to stand out the most. And make sure that you're reducing glare as much as you can. Allow for extra time so folks can finish their work. Try to avoid using word games or puzzles or graphs that may be confusing or create extra barriers for folks with visual impairments. And make sure that the room is quiet to enhance people's sense of hearing. You know how sometimes like one of our senses becomes lowered, and then other senses become heightened. So make sure that you're allowing them to hear as much as possible. For folks who are learning, let's talk about now folks who are learning disabled or have learning disabilities. About 1 in 5, approximately 1 in 5 persons in the United States is considered learning disabled. People can be, average or even above average intelligence and still have a learning disability. So the stigma, but the stigma of being somebody with a learning disability can really prevent that person from excelling academically, because they hear the term disability, they internalize that. I was working with a student at one point in a program for first-generation college students, and she was told she had a learning disability. And even though she was performing really, really well during her first year of college, that hung on to her, and she kept waiting for it to like creep up and create problems for her. So that stigma was really hard for her to overcome. And you know, if learning difficulties can be overcome by teaching it a little bit differently, then the person shouldn't be considered to have a learning disability. That's a teaching responsibility to make sure that we're teaching in the way that's going to help that individual to be successful. So the disability can create roadblocks in the brain, and that can prevent a person from processing and reproducing the relevant information. Coping strategies for many will learn strategies for processing the information. For example, using pictorial representations. Sometimes people will draw, sometimes people will just color and shade in different ways. Using multiple methodologies actually can be helpful to help people to overcome that barrier. So there's some national definitions of learning disabilities. It's a disorder of one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, or write, or spell, or do mathematical calculations. The term includes conditions such as handicaps or brain injuries or minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, developmental aphasia. But it doesn't include kids who have learning problems that are primarily the result of visual impairment or hearing or motor handicaps, any of those kinds of factors. There are hidden learning disabilities that you may not recognize right away as a health educator, so I want to make sure to talk about those, like impairment of motor skills. People might have limited attention and limited self-control, and they may not tell you that when you come in to do your presentation. They might have speech and hearing impairments or also memory impairments, and again, you come in and you start to ask different questions about something that you might have said, and they may have these and not be able to interact with you in the way that you're expecting them to. There may be emotional delay, sometimes very literal interpretations of what you're saying. People might be impulsive, and so there may be dyslexia or a number of other kinds of conditions, so as well as neurological signs. So impairment of motor skills is for people who have trouble reproducing the information that they receive through their senses. And so their written samples sometimes are poor, and there can be sometimes like spelling mistakes. So dyslexia is an example of this. Go ahead to the next one. And so some people have limited attention and self-control. They might have a hard time focusing for any length of time, and so you might need to like change up your materials. They might also get easily distracted, have trouble completing tasks. So if you're giving, like this might matter if you're giving a pre or post test, or like if you have a very long lecture, they might have trouble staying seated for periods of time, which is why when we're doing chapter 4, I talked about the importance of combining lots of different kinds of activities sometimes, so that way people with limited attention and self-control can still be comfortable in your learning environment. Folks with speech and hearing impairments may use incorrect grammar, or they may have trouble articulating certain words and thoughts. They might repeat the same phrases over and over, which can come from restricted language development. And then people with memory problems might have trouble memorizing information, especially if they are more tactile and they need to apply it. They also might not be able to remember very basic information or information that was learned just earlier that day or from the day before. For emotional delay, these are learners who may not have developed emotionally or socially to an age-appropriate level. Sometimes if you're in schools, these kids will be in a separate classroom. If they're integrated in, sometimes these kids have a really hard time because people don't see them as different, and they aren't different except for the fact that they're emotionally a little bit behind, and sometimes can be taken advantage of. And so they can become really frustrated, have difficulty with social interaction. Sometimes they can manifest in temper tantrums, and their peer relations might be really limited. They may feel more comfortable with younger kids. Folks who have literal interpretations have a hard time with abstract ideas such as metaphors. So they may seem like really rigid, or like they don't have a good sense of humor, or that they're gullible, but they're not. It's just that they interpret things quite literally. Folks who are impulsive are quick to respond with their reactions. So as a health educator, you might need to manage this by helping that person to kind of slow down, let other people get involved, and be included in your class, because otherwise the folks with impulsivity issues could really take all of your attention. And then learning deficits. They might be achieving less than their peers. And this isn't like across the board. So somebody, as the example here, might be on task or even ahead, for example, in reading, but maybe 2 grade levels behind in math. Equivocal neurological signs. There might not be direct evidence of neurological damage, but they might be hyperactive, they might show poor attention, they might have trouble concentrating. So for you as a health educator, just be aware of this, and if you have folks like this in your classroom, either coordinate with the teacher or the program director to find out how best to meet the needs of these individuals. And adults also have learning disabilities. So adults with learning disabilities might be well developed verbally, but have trouble conveying their ideas on paper. They might have poor skills related to reading or writing or spelling. So this may show up like in the pre and post test. So they may enjoy taking things apart and putting them back together. Some models could work well with this population. They might lack social tact or display, so they may appear socially inept or socially inappropriate. They may have, as a result, poor relationships with their peers. So that may come across as being like irresponsible. They may be irresponsible with their belongings or their time or their commitment. So these are folks that are always losing things, may constantly be late, may be disruptive to you, and they may appear to be high-strung or even lacking self-esteem, which leads to attention deficit disorder or hyperactivity disorder. This is becoming more and more, I think, something that people are aware of, which I think is helpful because it can allow us to address hyperactivity disorder more appropriately. And so, according to the Centers for Disease Control, this is a neural behavior disorder that is classified by pervasive inattention and hyperactivity. And so there's a number of strategies that you can use to help learners with ADD and ADHD. Prepare in advance, so work with individuals early and help to summarize the various activities for them. Remind learners about yesterday's lesson and review several times in describing the current lesson. Make sure that you state your learning objectives as a fundamental practice, and because it's going to help for people with learning disabilities, it's going to help them to organize the information and set your behavioral expectations. So let them know what you can expect of them and what they can expect of you, and what they'll be doing during your lesson and how they're going to go about accomplishing that. Make sure that you let them know in advance all the materials that they're going to need, and especially if it's something that they're going to need to bring. And then let them know how to get help. So if you're there, they might be able to draw upon you. If if you're not there, let them know what resources are available to help them if they run into problems in carrying out the tasks. So when constructing materials for people with learning disabilities, think about the design, the methods, and the practicality. So you want, for design, you want just a basic organizational design of material. It's got to be logical. It should go in order, in sequence, and really present building blocks of material. In terms of the method, think about whether the method should be used individually or with groups, and then also make sure that the materials are able to stand the test of time, to be able to be used both independently and with supervision. And then in terms of us as the presenters, we can take whatever it is that we're trying to teach and break it up into small, more manageable tasks with logical steps. We need to make sure that the objectives, again, are clear. And then get feedback often to make sure that people are still with you. Again, this is kind of a hard thing about online learning. And make sure that we're using age-appropriate graphics, diagrams, or pictures to supplement your verbal information. So also in terms of effectiveness, you want to model instructional practices and give people enough time to work independently. Definitely develop a positive learning environment, engage your students as much as possible, and then provide prompts and then modify whatever it is that you're trying to do based on individual needs. So if you find that they're having trouble or they're not responding to you, if things are going too fast or too slowly, be prepared to be able to adjust as needed. So here's some guidelines for teaching students with disabilities. So use repetition, use materials that have a mature theme, use interactive methods, make sure that materials are relevant to real life situations, include the opportunity for people to practice, and then use written materials with very simple, short sentences. So in terms of deafness, some people believe that folks who are deaf or hard of hearing are exactly like hearing individuals, except they can't hear. But that's pretty simplistic. There's actually some cultural nuances that need to be considered. So the deaf community is actually a community with a unique culture. So 90% of deaf children have two hearing parents. They don't necessarily acquire their cultural identity in the deaf community at home. So it's from outside of the home. And for many, learning the culture of the deaf community becomes, when they're part of it, they refer to deaf with a capital D. And not all deaf people, however, are part of the community. So if you're working with folks who are deaf, there's definitely a strong dependence on their visual sense. There's also a specified set of social norms between folks who are deaf. American Sign Language is the most commonly used form of communication. And people like to have strong ties within the deaf community. So sometimes people think that all hearing losses are the same, and that's not true. People also might assume that all folks who are deaf can't speak or are mute, and that's not true. People with impaired hearing, sometimes people assume that people with impaired hearing are both deaf and dumb. They think that people who are deaf will use hearing aids, which isn't true, and that the hearing aids could restore the hearing. Again, not true. They assume all deaf people can read lips, and that noises won't bother them, which again, noises can bother people who are deaf. Because people can't speak sometimes, There's an assumption that because they're deaf, they're less intelligent, which is unfair and untrue. And it's also not right to assume that deaf people are all alike in terms of what they enjoy, what they believe, and what their outlook is in life. So make sure that you face the deaf person. Maintain eye contact at all times. Avoid glare. Speak slowly and clearly. Get rid of any kind of background noise so that way any sound is clear. Don't exaggerate just because you're talking to somebody deaf. So if you think they're lip reading, this is not the time to, exaggerate everything that you're saying. Do keep your objects and hands away from your mouth. There was a mistake I made once. I was working with an interpreter, and I kept touching my face, and it was really distracting people. So emphasize keywords when appropriate that will also help the interpreter, and give as many visual cues as possible. And consider your choice of words very carefully. So try to avoid run-on sentences. Think of your words more like haiku and less of an essay. If you need to get the attention of a person, call his name or title such as sir. Tap the person on the shoulder or the arm to get their attention. Wave your hand, but don't be all frantic about it. Make sure that the person is looking at you before you start to speak. Or you can tap the table or the counter if it's inappropriate to touch the person. And so if you're going to communicate through writing, keep your writing brief and to the point. Try to overlook any kinds of grammatical errors and just focus really on what the meaning is. Draw attention to your written message. Use open-ended questions to draw the person out. And then face the person after you've written your message. So even though you've written it, you still want to face them like you're having eye contact. And then you can ask the person who's deaf to rephrase what you said to make sure that the person understood what you said, and to avoid any potential misunderstandings. If you're working with an interpreter, sit close to the interpreter, and then place graphics or models near you and the interpreter. Speak at a reasonable pace. Look at the deaf person. Don't look at the interpreter, and address that person directly. Leave time for the interpreter to finish because sometimes they get a few words behind, especially if they're working in American Sign Language or something like that. If they have to spell something, that can take some time. Also, you know what you're about to say, but the interpreter doesn't, so they've got to sometimes catch up to you. Just give them time to do that. Adjust the lighting as needed, and then allow the person who's deaf time to ask questions or to respond. And only say what you need to have interpreted. So no extra conversation to the interpreter, because that's disrespectful of the person who is deaf. If you're working in groups, make sure that the people who are deaf are in the best proximity to you and to the interpreter. Try to stay in one place. So if you're moving around the room, it's going to be hard for them to see your face. If they're lip reading, they can't necessarily always see your lips. So you try to stay in one place. Make sure that you face the deaf person when you're speaking. Definitely use visual aids, graphics, charts, that sort of thing. And then allow them time to look at the visual aids before speaking. So just take a moment, pause, give them time to look at everything. Prepare handouts with written instructions. Repeat your questions. And then if audience members ask questions or comments, be sure to repeat them. It's always good to do that anyway, but it's particularly important when you're working with folks who are deaf. And use hands-on activities as much as possible. If you're hosting a meeting, just be aware that there's different types of interpreting and ask the interpreters what they need. Schedule them a few weeks in advance because they get very booked up. And I always schedule 2 so that way they can take a break. So, because it can be very tiring. Give the interpreters handouts in advance. And make sure that you familiarize them with any technical terms or jargon that they're going to need to be interpreting for you. Make sure that you're aware of their seating and lighting preferences to make it as comfortable as possible, and work all of that out in advance. And then if the interpreter is working alone, give that person lots of breaks. So in summary, we need to have a good knowledge of special populations, including information on the demographics and health problems that are unique to specific populations. We need to familiarize ourselves with the laws relating to the provision of services. As folks get integrated into classrooms, we need to be prepared to make sure that our education materials and interventions can appeal to all individuals. And that we need to familiarize ourselves with the resources specifically designed to meet the needs of exceptional populations. And before we end this video, I would like for Riley to come in front of the camera so I can introduce you. So this has been the man behind the camera for all of your chapters, and I just wanted him to say hi and to say formally thank you. So thank you, and that's the end of chapter 9.